In the last several lectures, we've looked at the Germanic tribes who took over many of the former provinces of the Western Roman Empire, and they predominantly ruled over a Roman Catholic population. And we ended the last lecture with the death of Theodoric in 526. 6 years after Theodoric's death, the Franks were on the move again. This time their prime target was the Burgundians. The Burgundians had consolidated their power in southeastern Gaul. They had allied themselves with the Franks many times in the past, especially against the Visigoths. The Burgundians had cemented their alliance with the Franks mainly because Clotilda, as the wife of the Frankish king Clovis, was a native Burgundian. But after Clovis died in 511, his kingdom was split between his 4 sons, Clotaire, Childebert, Clodomir, and Teuderic. By the way, it was Frankish tradition to split the kingdom up between all male heirs of age. This would eventually weaken the Frankish kingdom centuries later. In any event, the sons of Clovis were determined to take over all of Gaul, and the last remaining holdout were the Burgundians. The first expedition occurred in 524, and was largely a successful campaign, except Clodomir was killed in battle. 8 years later, his brothers Clotaire and Childebert led another invasion, and inflicted a severe and lasting defeat upon the Burgundians. After this, the Burgundians were absorbed into the increasingly powerful Frankish kingdom. This meant that the Franks now controlled all of what was once Roman Gaul. 1 year after the Franks defeated the Burgundians, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian was about to launch a major invasion of North Africa. Before we get to Justinian, I thought I would do a short review on the 4 main emperors that preceded him. During the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was beginning to disintegrate. Province after province was falling to the invading Germanic chieftains. The Eastern Roman Empire, however, survived the onslaught, maintaining its borders. There are 2 main reasons for this. First, the Eastern Roman emperors in the 5th century were superior to the Western Roman emperors who had become increasingly irrelevant. The Eastern Roman emperors had earned their way to the top and had previously held high positions. Collectively, they possessed a vast amount of experience. The Eastern emperors also maintained a strong and very loyal army, along with a sizable treasury. The second main reason was geography. Ravenna, which became the capital of the Western Roman Empire, was a stronghold surrounded by swamps, but it really did little else to protect the surrounding territory. German chieftains would simply bypass the city altogether and attack Rome. Also, Ravenna was located just off the coast, so the city could not be resupplied by sea. Constantinople, on the other hand, was far superior in terms of its location. It could protect most of the Eastern Roman Empire to the east and south. It also maintained a harbor so supplies could be shipped in if the city came under siege. Now let's take a look at the 4 main emperors that preceded Justinian. Leo I reigned from 457 to 474. It was under Leo's watch that the Western Roman Empire began to disintegrate. Leo did his best to assist the West by sending forces to help subdue the Vandals, but ultimately this failed. Leo also had to deal with Germanic influences on Eastern Roman policy. Although the Germanic tribes had a much greater influence in the West, there were some individuals who had Germanic heritage that achieved quite a bit of influence in Constantinople itself. Leo decided to execute some of these individuals, thus eliminating the Germanic influence. After Leo came Zeno. It was Zeno who was emperor in the East when the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was deposed in 476. The main threat Zeno had to deal with were the Ostrogoths. Instead of pushing west like many of the other Germanic tribes, the Ostrogoths pushed east and into Balkan territory. Despite a signed peace treaty, the Ostrogoths could not be trusted, and conducted several raids into Thrace and Macedonia. Eventually, Zeno was able to convince Theodoric to invade Italy, which ended the Gothic menace. It also allowed the Eastern Roman Empire to reassert control over their European provinces. After Zeno came Anastasius. Anastasius had to face a new threat to the northern borders: the Slavs. The Slavs had replaced the Ostrogoths to the north. They too raided Thrace and other provinces, though early on the Slavs were not quite as dangerous as the Ostrogoths. The most serious threat Anastasius faced was a rebellion orchestrated by one of his leading generals. The emperor, however, was able to survive the revolt. Anastasius turned out to be an excellent administrator and accumulated 300,000 pounds of gold in the treasury. After Anastasius came Justin I. Justin was nearly 70 years old when he came to the throne. Before assuming the title of emperor, he had been in command of the imperial guard, so he had considerable influence. You will remember it was Justin who had mended the schism between the East and West over the nature of Christ. Other than that, Justin's reign was rather unremarkable. He did, however, adopt his nephew Justinian, who became the heir apparent. Justinian ascended to the throne in 527. He was crowned in the Sancta Sophia on Easter Day. Justinian had several advantages. First, he had a vast treasury at his disposal. In addition, the kingdom was relatively stable and prosperous. Justinian possessed an extraordinary amount of energy. He took a keen interest in every facet of the civil government. He even wanted to rewrite and update the existing Roman laws. Justinian also saw it as his mission to reconquer all of the territory lost after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And the justification for this? Justinian claimed he could use his absolute authority as Byzantine emperor to claim back the territories that, in his view, had been taken illegally by the Germanic kings. Well, if you're going to start a campaign of this magnitude, you better have a great general at your disposal. And Justinian possessed just such a general in Belisarius. Belisarius has often been called the last Roman general, but he also was an excellent tactician and military planner. Previously, Belisarius had enjoyed a large amount of success against the Persians, using innovative tactics to outmaneuver and defeat the enemy. A year earlier in 532, Belisarius had helped Justinian suppress the Nika riots which broke out in Constantinople. These were the most serious riots in the history of the city. Previously, there had been many riots, but none of them were as destructive as the Nika riots. The main cause, as usual, were finances. Justinian had recently dipped into the treasury in order to conduct the Persian War. This led to increased taxation, which, not surprisingly, was resented by the population. The main target of their frustration was John the Cappadocian. He was accused of living lavishly while extorting taxes out of the Roman population. The source of the riots involved chariot racing teams. Initially, these teams were only involved in the sport itself, but gradually they began to represent major political factions in the empire. There were initially 4 major racing teams: the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, and the Whites. But in reality, only 2 teams maintained a power base: the Blues and the Greens. The Blue team supported Justinian, while the Green team supported rival factions. In 531, a riot broke out that resulted in several deaths. Previously, Justinian had given the Blues a wide degree of latitude, but this time he decided to crack down on both teams. Justinian had members of both the Blues and Greens arrested for murder. Several were executed, but a Blue and Green leader were able to escape, taking refuge in the sanctuary of a church. Now Justinian faced an immediate crisis, since both the Blues and Greens were united against him. Complicating the whole matter was the fact that most of his army were outside the city. The army was positioned east against the Persians. Justinian was attempting at that time to conclude a treaty with the Persians. Facing a possible revolt, the emperor declared that a chariot race would be held on January 13th, and he commuted the leaders' sentences to imprisonment. The Blues and Greens responded by demanding that the 2 men be pardoned entirely. When that didn't occur, the riots began to break out in the Hippodrome. Initially, the crowd began to hurl insults at Justinian. Then the crowd began to shout "Nika, Nika," which means victory. After this, the crowds began to assault the palace itself. For the next 5 days, the palace was under siege. Justinian did nothing to stop the riots and simply stayed put in his imperial palace. Eventually, the mob claimed their own emperor. Justinian actually considered fleeing the capital, especially after the riots began to spread throughout the city. He even ordered his personal ship to make preparations for a departure. As the emperor and his ministers were holding a meeting to plan their escape, his wife Theodora rose and spoke. Quote, "Those whose interests are threatened by extreme danger should only think of the wisest course of action, not of conventions. In my opinion, flight is not the right course, even if it should bring us safety. It is impossible for a person having been born into this world not to die. But for one who has reigned in it, it is intolerable to be a fugitive. May I never be deprived of this purple robe. And may I never see the day when those who meet me do not call me Empress. If you wish to save yourself, my lord, there is no difficulty. We are rich. Over there is the sea, and yonder are the ships. Yet reflect for a moment, when you have once escaped to a palace of security, you would not gladly exchange such safety for death. As for me, I agree with the adage that the royal purple is the noblest shroud." End quote. The speech galvanized Justinian, and he decided to remain inside the city to save the throne. He quickly ordered Belisarius to suppress the riots. Procopius relates that 30,000 Roman citizens were killed in the brutal crackdown that followed. Justinian was also able to conclude a peace treaty with the Persians. The war with the Persians had resulted in little change to the borders, and was more of a stalemate, though Belisarius had achieved some significant victories. The treaty signed was called the Eternal Peace. The Persians would retain control over Iberia, and the Byzantines maintain control over Lazica. The treaty with the Persians paved the way for the Byzantines to launch a massive campaign in the west. The first target would be the Vandals. The Vandals had a rather interesting history. The Vandal state was different in many respects from the other Germanic kingdoms of the era. Many Germanic tribes were captivated by the Romans and attempted to assimilate with them. But the Vandals were keen on keeping their old Germanic traditions intact. They continued to speak their own language instead of speaking Latin, and they also rarely intermixed with the native Romans they ruled over. The Vandals were a Germanic tribe constantly on the move. It was believed the Vandals originated from southern Scandinavia. Eventually they migrated to an area that today consists of modern-day Hungary. When the Huns began their rampage in the early 5th century, the Vandals were pushed westward into the Iberian Peninsula. Soon they established a kingdom in North Africa around 439. Essentially, this meant the Vandals claimed the Western Roman Empire's provinces in North Africa as their own. Carthage, which was captured in 439, became the capital of the newly formed Vandal kingdom. From Africa, the Vandals expanded into Corsica, Sardinia, and Malta. They took Sicily, but eventually were expelled by the Ostrogoths. The Vandals even sacked Rome in 455. As a result of the Vandal sack of Rome and continued piracy in the Mediterranean, the Roman Empire wanted to destroy the Vandal kingdom for good. In 460, the Western Roman Emperor launched an expedition against the Vandals, but the Roman force was defeated at the Battle of Cartagena. In 468, the Western and Eastern Roman Empires combined forces to launch an enormous expedition against the Vandals. The massive force numbered at 100,000 soldiers and 1,000 ships. The expedition enjoyed some early success, capturing Sardinia and Libya, but the Vandals launched a surprise attack against the Roman fleet that was anchored near Carthage. The Vandals used fire ships which were propelled against the Roman fleet. Ships that were not burned were either sunk or captured by the Vandalic fleet. It was in every sense a total disaster for the Romans. After this incident, the Romans gave up their war policy against the Vandals. In fact, the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno soon concluded a treaty with the Vandals. This allowed the Vandals to establish what became a relatively stable kingdom. The Vandals even produced their own coinage, and they enjoyed decades of relative stability until an incident occurred in 531 that would change everything. In that year, Hilderic, the king of the Vandals, was deposed by his cousin Gelimer. Hilderic had previously maintained excellent relations with the Eastern Roman Empire. Hilderic even allowed many Vandals to convert to Catholicism. This angered many Vandals, including members of Hilderic's own family, especially Gelimer, who revolted against Hilderic. After Gelimer took the throne, he restored Arianism as the official religion of the Vandal kingdom. He then imprisoned Hilderic and his supporters. When Justinian learned of the revolt, he immediately ordered Gelimer to restore Hilderic. As far as Justinian was concerned, he was overlord over all of the Germanic kingdoms, and the Germanic kings were effectively his vassals. In any event, Gelimer rejected Justinian's order outright. This gave Justinian the only excuse he needed to invade North Africa 2 years later in 533. The main account of this expedition is given to us by the Roman historian Procopius. Procopius accompanied Belisarius and actually participated in the campaign against the Vandals. Procopius relates that Belisarius' army numbered at 10,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, along with 20,000 sailors. The entire fleet checked in at 500 ships. On the surface, this seemed like a grossly undersized force, but in reality, it was not. Belisarius' army was composed of crack troops who had fought numerous campaigns against Persia. The Vandals, on the other hand, were no longer the ferocious warriors they had been in the 5th century. They had become accustomed to decades of peace in the moderate North African climate on the coasts of the Mediterranean. With his army ready to set sail, Emperor Justinian decided to throw a massive going-away celebration. Procopius gives us the description. Quote, "In the 7th year of Justinian's reign, at about the spring equinox, the emperor commanded the general's ship to anchor off the point, which is before the royal palace. Also came the chief priest of the city, and after uttering an appropriate prayer, he put on the ship one of the soldiers who had lately been baptized and had taken the Christian name. And after this, the general Belisarius and Antonina, his wife, set sail." End quote. The fleet first sailed to Heraclea. Here they waited for horses which, according to Procopius, were from the emperor's own royal pastures. 5 days later, the fleet pushed on to Abydos, a city that had played a prominent role in the latter stages of the Peloponnesian War. 4 more days were lost to a lack of favorable winds. During the layover at Abydos, Belisarius began to worry about his fleet's crossing of the Aegean Sea. Countless ships during ancient times had been lost during many of those violent storms that could whip up out of nowhere on the Aegean Sea. Procopius relates that Belisarius came up with a unique solution. Quote, "For he knew that in a large fleet, and especially if rough winds should assail them, it was inevitable that many of the ships should be left behind and scattered on the open sea, and that their pilots should not know which of the ships that put to sea ahead of them it was better to follow. So after considering the matter, he did as follows. From the sails of the 3 ships in which he and his following were carried, he painted red from the upper corner for about 1/3 of their length, and he erected upright poles on the prow of each, and hung lights from them, so that both by day and by night the general ships might be distinguishable. Then he commanded all the pilots to follow these ships. Thus, with the 3 ships leading the whole fleet, not a single ship was left behind." End quote. Eventually, the fleet made it across the Aegean Sea, anchoring off the port of Methone. Once again, there was a lack of good winds, so Belisarius allowed his entire army to disembark for the shore. At this point, Procopius relates a curious incident that occurred. 500 men died of dysentery after consuming moldy bread. According to Procopius, responsibility for their deaths was placed on a man named John the Cappadocian. Apparently, John wanted to cut costs by having the bread baked once instead of twice. This would reduce the amount of firewood needed to bake the bread. With the batch of bread ruined, Belisarius ordered the local markets to supply his army with fresh bread. After this incident, the fleet pushed on to Zakynthos, where fresh supplies of water were gathered for a crossing of the Adriatic Sea. Procopius relates that most of the water for the fleet was spoiled during the journey, except for Belisarius' own drinking water. Apparently, Belisarius' wife had the foresight to place the water in glass jars, and, quote, "in a small room in the hold of the ship, where it was impossible for the sun to penetrate, and where she sank the jars in sand, and by this means the water remained unaffected." End quote. Next, Belisarius and the fleet made a landing in Sicily at a deserted area near Mount Etna. Here, Belisarius wanted to gather more intelligence on the Vandals. He dispatched Procopius ahead of the army to Syracuse. Procopius was ordered to gather more information on the Vandals. Belisarius wanted to know what sort of soldiers the Vandals were, and what type of tactics the Byzantines would need to defeat the Vandals. He also wanted to find out where the best landing spot was off the coast of Africa. One thing Belisarius was determined to avoid at all costs was a major naval engagement. He wanted to fight the Vandals on land. After all, his veterans were far more used to land warfare. At Syracuse, Procopius was also expected to secure provisions for the Byzantine fleet. During this time, Sicily was under the control of the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths apparently were willing to open their markets to the Byzantines, especially since Emperor Justinian was on good terms with the young king of the Ostrogoths. After Theodoric died, his nephew Antalaric came to the throne, but he was too young to rule effectively, so his mother ruled as regent. According to Procopius, Antalaric's mother was fearful of a Byzantine invasion, so she ordered the Goths in Sicily to resupply Belisarius. While Procopius was in Syracuse, he ran into an old friend. The friend related to Procopius that the Vandals were completely unaware of the Byzantine army's presence in Sicily. He also related that a large part of the Vandal army had been sent on a marathon expedition to Sardinia, leaving Carthage relatively undefended. In addition, the king of the Vandals, Gelimer, wasn't even at Carthage. Upon receiving this news, Belisarius wasted no time and ordered his fleet to set sail for Africa. The Roman fleet set anchor near the port city of Caput Vada. Here, Belisarius held a council of war on board the flagship. His leading generals pushed for Belisarius to immediately set sail for Carthage and lay siege to the capital. But Belisarius was worried that that type of maneuver might end up in catastrophe. He was keenly aware of the Roman naval expedition that had ended in disaster in 468. He said, quote, "And if at that very time when we are engaged in conflict, a storm also comes upon us, as often happens on the sea, then while struggling both against the waves and against the Vandals, we should come to regret our prudence. As for me, then I say that we must disembark upon the land with all possible speed, landing horses and arms and whatever else we consider necessary, and that we must dig a trench quickly and throw a stockade around us of a kind which can contribute to our safety, no less than any walled town one might mention, and with that as our base, must carry on the war from there if anyone should attack us." End quote. After this speech, the other Roman generals agreed to make an immediate landing. The Byzantines constructed the usual trench and stockade. Realizing speed was of the essence, Belisarius ordered the entire army to participate in the stockade's construction. A fresh water source was discovered which, quote, "sufficed for all uses of both men and animals," end quote. The Byzantines took this as a good sign of things to come. An enormous amount of credit must be given to Belisarius in this matter. It would have been an easy decision to immediately lay siege to Carthage, and perhaps that might have worked out. But Belisarius took stock of the situation and deemed it wise to establish a base of operations. After all, his army was halfway across the Mediterranean, and if anything went wrong, the entire expedition could have been wiped out. It was more important to establish a base rather than risk everything on an immediate assault against Carthage. We will continue on with part 2 of the Vandalic Wars in the next video.